Hello and welcome to Voices of BlueScope, the podcast where we go behind the scenes at BlueScope to meet the people who create strength every day. I'm your host, Martin Feld. Thank you for joining us. In this episode, we're featuring a one-on-one interview with Robin Davies, the new Chief Executive Australia and New Zealand at BlueScope. Robin took the time to share his personal background growing up in Wales and his experience as a long-time BlueScope employee. He also elaborated on what excites him about this expanded role, now and into the future, and how it is already enabling him to reconnect with many people across the company. Let's shift to the interview now.
Things probably start working on a family farm in terms of maintaining and keeping large agricultural machinery going is probably the early kind of childhood and teenage kind of memories. And then obviously subsequently studied mechanical engineering and then started a career in the steel industry in 1996. You actually move into a more professional environment with lots of resources, much larger assets and capability around you. You're very autonomous, let's say, when you're working in a family kind of business and have to be very resourceful in terms of getting things going. Lots of very long hours and hard work hasn't kind of stopped probably in the steel industry. But typically you've got more people around you, higher consequences, and you got more support around you, I would say, is the key thing that characterizes the change.
You mentioned the family farm there. What can you tell us about growing up on that farm and what was your exposure to some of the machinery or things that you saw there?
I think it was part of a sort of a contracting kind of business. We used to do lots of harvesting for neighbouring kind of farms. So harvest kind of season is quite a high intensity time of the year. You've got to get a lot done in a short period of time. The condition of the equipment is important and the reliability and runtime was very important to the family business. And lots of our neighbouring farmers were very dependent on you getting the job done on time. So lots of these things kind of flow on into in later life and the importance of people depending on equipment to perform and good service levels and getting a good job done for a customer. So those things stood out for me early on and having to fix and repair and maintain equipment in relatively intense environments.
So it taught you some early interesting and useful lessons about performing on time and efficiently.
It did, yeah, it did.
Fantastic. Now, your first day in the steel industry, what can you tell us about that? What was it like entering this industry that's carried on through your career?
Early memories of British Steel, it's a steel industry has, gone through its kind of commodity cycle challenges all around the world. And, British Steel would have gone through more than its fair share of economic kind of cycles, changes to the operating footprint, plant closures, redundancies. And, that probably showed up in the form of aging kind of assets, businesses in various levels of, let's say, distress from a financial performance point of view, if I think looking back. So, you had to be quite resourceful and driven to find ways of maintaining and operating kind of equipment. And but fond memories of learning from some great kind of engineering kind of people around me, some people that probably took me under the wing earlier on. I probably turned up with a lot of enthusiasm and drive and a willingness to learn. I was probably a complete nightmare in lots of ways for lots of people I worked for at the time, but they did spend time and show lots of patience to impart their knowledge on me. I was able to get involved in more and more complex and challenging situations as it went forward. So the more I took on, the more the people around me put me in control of, and it was a great early kind of learning kind of part of my sort of career. So really fond memories, very intense, lots of long days and nights, and my partner, who's now my wife, probably didn't see a lot of me in those days. For having children, so spend long days working in the steelworks. But really fond memories of those early days.
Now, British Steel, that's quite some time ago in the globe-trotting of your career. So what was the next step from British Steel? Where did your travels and your roles take you?
So I think obviously British Steel became Chorus as it sort of joined with Hoogevens, the Dutch steelmaking business, and then was acquired by Tata Steel in 2008. So that was the kind of the transition of that organization, which was quite significant. And then I came to, in 2008, traveled to be the maintenance superintendent or asset manager for the steelmaking facility in New Zealand Steel. Did a motorhome tour with my family around the North and South Island of New Zealand, had a couple of job interviews, one being with BlueScope, and was appointed as the slab making maintenance superintendent in January 2008. So that was my first sort of step into working for BlueScope. And yeah, obviously then many different roles within New Zealand Steel, Pacific Steel, North Star, and then back to New Zealand Steel then in 2020. So yeah.
Moving to New Zealand, what were the things that stood out to you, and what was maybe different about working in that industrial setting from where you had come from in British Steel? What was different about being in New Zealand?
Look, from a cultural alignment point of view, New Zealand's a pretty easy country to kind of slot into from a work and sort of lifestyle culture point of view. There were sort of tinges of old British steel that, seemed to kind of permeate the organization. You can imagine the steel industry in New Zealand, to a large extent, was set up by lots of expat British people that came and helped and build the steelworks here back in the 60s. So it has got connections back to, let's say, the UK in lots of kind of ways. Yeah, there are some similarities from the older British Steel kind of model, let's say, early on. But I think as time goes on, businesses evolve. And again, I would probably suggest that the business in New Zealand is very different to the one I turned up in sort of 18 or so years ago. I think businesses and culture has to evolve to stay competitive and stay relevant. Otherwise, you get left behind pretty quickly. So,
interestingly about New Zealand as well, and we'll get to things, I suppose, later on in this interview before we finish about the electric arc furnace that's been developed there, which is very exciting for New Zealand Steel and even globally across the whole business. But what interested you about the unique nature of the iron sands and the business there? I mean, were you surprised by what you saw and how they actually create steel?
Yeah, look, I think obviously I turned up working in the steelmaking facility, which was, so the steelmaking part of New Zealand Steel and downstream from there is fairly typical of sort of global steelmaking. The basic oxygen kind of process is very similar to how New Zealand Steel does that. But the iron making kind of process, as you point out, is still probably unique in the world. It's based on having some very specific local raw materials in the form of iron sand and thermal coal, and a process that was developed by the sort of the pioneers of this business back in the 60s to use, I guess, domestic raw materials, which were pretty cheap back in those days, and has meant that business, has the iron making part of the operation, has been able to maintain a very low cost kind of DRI process, as we refer to it today, for many years. So it's certainly been a strategic asset. It's an asset that is very energy intensive and maintenance intensive comparatively to sort of the blast furnace or the electric arc furnace process. So there are some trade-offs. I have deep admiration for the people that thought up and built and commissioned our existing iron making process. It would have taken a huge amount of patience and resilience to get that going. And it's still quite a challenging process today after 40 years to maintain and run that process. Yeah.
And of course, we recently had the big 60th anniversary of New Zealand Steel last year, as of this recording, which was very exciting and a great time to reflect on a lot of the things that make that business very interesting. What did that mean to you to be in New Zealand for this major anniversary?
These milestones are very significant. And in steelmaking terms, 60 years is relatively short if you think about it, the global kind of aspect of that. But in terms of a relatively young country, 60 years was very important, to the development of New Zealand's economy back in those days when they were think big projects where, the government were intent on building its own sort of capability to help support a growing economy. Built an aluminium smelter, an oil refinery, a steel work. So there were some very strong intentions from the government of those days. And, like I say, the people who developed and built the steelmaking process here, a small scale steelmaking industry in a small country, has really taken some effort. Yeah, look, it's great to be part of the 60-year milestone. And I guess at the same time, be contemplating what the future shape of the business looks like. I think always, if you're standing still, you've got to be very careful that you're not going backwards. And I think we needed to make a change in part to the iron and steel making kind of process, where the electric arc furnace opportunities come from. And it sees us set up a sustainable steelmaking future for the New Zealand business.
You mentioned before North Star in your history, which also, as we record in 2026, is celebrating its 30th anniversary, I recall, which is fantastic. Congratulations to North Star. How did you end up at North Star, and what can you tell us about your time there? What were the interesting things that you learned and the challenges there?
Look, I was running a P&L part of New Zealand Steel for Pacific Steel. So when we acquired Pacific Steel, I was the general manager of that business. And I guess at the time, I was keen to pursue, larger P&L roles within the BlueScope organization. And, I was very fortunate to be asked to go and be the president of the North Star business, with almost a unique kind of business model and culture. Started as a joint venture, as with BHP and Cargill, set up, in the mid-90s, and people like John Nowlan and others were heavily involved in the building of that kind of business. And again, huge admiration for the people that sort of thought about the business model and built that business and went through very difficult early years to kind of get going. But they are, a remarkable group of people who run that business in the way that they do. Look, again, you just get this appreciation of the scale of the market, the scale of the industry. There's some really significant contrast from, I came from the UK, which is a reasonably large steel industry with all that comes with that. And then coming to New Zealand, it's a much smaller country with a much smaller footprint. And then back to the US was a 100 million ton steel market with vast sort of manufacturing kind of businesses, still a very active automotive industry, which is where and why North Star was built, essentially just south of the Detroit car manufacturing operations, and significant amount of scrap available in that kind of region. And the team thought carefully about the business model and the location. And to this day, 30 years on, is still absolutely the right place to have that electric arc furnace business. And as you know, we've gone on to expand that asset based on a successful business model. And it obviously benefits from, the regulatory supportive nature of the US. But again, what the team have done there to expand that asset and get it to the throughput levels that they have is a real credit to them. Obviously, the North Star business, as we know, is a very strong contributor to the overall profitability of BlueScope. So it's a really, really successful business. And I was honored to be working there for the 3 years. A great group of people to work with, just very straightforward, hardworking kind of people who were a pleasure to work with, actually. So it was, fond memories in that working sense.
That's great to hear. And personally speaking, what was it like to move your family to the United States in what is a very different area from what you would have been experiencing in New Zealand?
It is a very different area. I guess probably my family have, used to a little bit of moving, in the sense of we moved to New Zealand when my eldest two sons were 1 and 3. Not that they remember too much about that, but then moving them to live in Toledo, Ohio, when they were relatively young, they thrived living there, learned how to play American football and ice hockey and all of those things they probably wouldn't have done living in this part of the world, and experienced substantial amounts of snow and ice, which also they wouldn't have experienced too much in New Zealand. But look, they made great friends who they're still in contact with, and it was just a very different sort of lifestyle, which I think for anybody moving around the world just gives you new perspectives and makes you adaptable to all sorts of situations. So as you say, could not be a more different place to go and live and work from, say, rural New Zealand to the industrial heartland of the US. I have very fond memories of living and working in Ohio.
Yeah, and you bring those experiences with you, and you've brought that experience back to New Zealand. What was the path from having moved to the US and all those great experiences that you mentioned with the great people there to returning to New Zealand and assuming the leadership position there?
Yeah, look, I think I actually came back from North Star. It was time for me to come back to New Zealand at the time, to sort of see some of my family through their sort of schooling years, let's say, in one place, keep them in one place at the same time for a little while. And Yeah, so I came back into the sales and marketing role in New Zealand Steel for a little while. So that was a little bit of a step out from largely P&L and manufacturing sort of roles. So, going into the pure sales and marketing function, I learned a lot during that period. And then I was obviously able to take up the chief executive role then a couple of years later when I took over from Greta when she went into the climate change and sustainability role. So I've been very fortunate to have worked in different parts of the world, in different markets, and operate with different steel technologies and regulatory environments. And you learn a lot from that. And hopefully then you can apply that to each new situation that you come across, whether that's in the US, in New Zealand. It turns out that the electric arc furnace technology was an appropriate transition for this business. So, it certainly suited the situation and opportunity to decarbonize. Having worked in the sort of downstream parts of markets in the UK and New Zealand, and then there are many of those experiences and sort of that are relevant in the Australian context. Having spent some time over with the ASP team over the last couple of months, getting myself up the curve and spending some time in the downstream business and seeing what the channels to market and products that we kind of develop there. It turns out that I've got experience of some of that from my time in the UK when I ran a downstream business for Chorus, roll forming and decking and those kind of things. So it turns out that's quite relevant to what we do in ASP. So after just about 30 years of working in the steel supply chains and upstream and downstream in different parts of the world, you inevitably tick up experiences then that turn out to be very relevant into the new job. So whilst I certainly wouldn't claim to be across all of what I need to be for the ASP role, it turns out there's quite a bit sort of that's in the experience tool bag, if you want to put it that way, that's very helpful for the new role. So
wonderful. And I'm glad you brought up the ASP or Australian Steel Products element of this, because we are speaking about your expanded role across both New Zealand and Australia. Is there something that excites you the most about having this massive extra element to the role?
Yeah, look, it's hugely exciting to be part of what really has been the core of BlueScope for since its inception. So being part of the historic business that it is exciting in of itself. I follow in the footsteps of some very illustrious sort of predecessors. There's a huge depth of capability within the business across all of the functions, the manufacturing business and the downstream aspects of it. So, the channels to market, the fact that we are as integrated as we are in the Australian steel sector is very exciting. And I think the steel industry in Australia is at a little bit of a transition kind of point where there's broader industry opportunities that are in play that I think BlueScope can certainly play a larger role in as well, in addition to the existing kind of footprint potentially. And I think it's got great sort of channels to market, so customers. The BBC business is particularly exciting in terms of how it sort of, creates those sort of solutions for the market. And I guess we've got our distribution channels as well as a very capable manufacturing kind of footprint. And then equally, it has very challenging situations around energy, availability of natural gas in particular, and, the sort of safeguard mechanism that challenges us from an emissions reduction point of view long term. So there's some really exciting opportunities on one hand and some quite challenging topics to kind of navigate and negotiate over the coming years. So, playing a part in all of that is exciting and challenging in equal parts, probably.
Thank you so much. That's given such a great comprehensive view, not only of the businesses that you're running and dealing with, but also how you approach things personally. As we wrap up this interview, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you'd like to cover? Anything that you're excited about in the future, or what it means to work with the business? Anything personally you'd like to mention?
Oh, look, I'm really excited to work with the Australian lead team and their team members. There's a huge capability there. So I'm excited by learning from them and kind of helping us kind of develop as a team overall. It is interesting, after a reasonable amount of time in BlueScope, you end up developing a reasonably kind of strong network from just working on different projects with people. So it is interesting as I kind of contemplate starting the new role, I'm actually reconnecting with numbers of people that I've worked with over the time. And I worked with Dave Scott in New Zealand. I've worked with Chris Page before in New Zealand. I've worked with Mark Cicluna, on the North Star expansion when we were both in different roles at the time. Just to mention a few, obviously the manufacturing team I'm fairly familiar with. So it's great to see how those networks developed over many years, then help you kind of get going more quickly than you otherwise would. So I think, certainly encourage everybody to sort of foster their kind of business kind of networks, because they really sort of help later on in your career. So I think that's something that struck me in the last month or two.
Well, Robin, thank you so much for sparing the time to speak with us today on Voices of BlueScope. I know that many people know you already, but for those who don't, or maybe within Australia or around the world who are listening to this show, I think it's a great opportunity for employees and external audiences to get to know you in this role.
Oh, that's great, Martin. It's been great to take part in this, and looking forward to kind of getting to meet people as many as I can, quickly as I can. So it's exciting times for me.
We hope that you enjoyed our interview with Robin, and we appreciate the time that he gave to this podcast. To learn more about the topics that were discussed, view the show notes for this episode in your browser or podcast app. For example, you'll find a link to a recent project update video on TV BlueScope that shows progress at the New Zealand Steel Electric Arc Furnace, featuring narration by Robin Davies and Tanya Archibald. Thank you for listening to the Voices of BlueScope podcast. Until next time.